Hi everyone, today's mini course is on digestion, and I like to say it's from plate to porcelain pasture. So the contents are the digestive system, the human digestion process, digestive hormones, the breakdown into nutrients, and the dysfunctions of digestion. So essentially, your digestive system is an extremely complex tube from the mouth to the anus, essentially from the plate to the porcelain pasture. And in this digestive system, there's an exchange of macro and micronutrients. And the macronutrients are your carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And the micronutrients are all your vitamins and minerals and proteins or amino acids. And about probably over 80% of your immune system is in your gut, and it's called the enteric nervous system. And it essentially can function on its own. It has its own brain, so it's pretty smart. And it has a lot of communication to the brain via the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. It's called the wandering nerve because it wanders all the way from the brain to the gut and the gut to the brain. So basically, the gut is your window to health. It's your basis of everything. And so if your gut is not functioning right, your rest of your body is not going to function right. And so the best way to establish overall health is to improve your gut function. And Hippocrates says all disease begins in the gut, and Dr. Amy Denick says all absence of disease begins in the gut. So let's begin. Let's go ahead and start with the gross anatomy of the GI tract. And again, like I said, it starts in the mouth. And not only do you chew food with your teeth, so teeth are important, and mouth alignment, teeth alignment, jaw alignment, but you secrete a lot of different enzymes in the salivary glands. And there's different salivary glands throughout the mouth and in the neck. And they secrete different enzymes, and a lot of these enzymes like amylase will break down sugars in the food. So if you're a fast chewer, like if you eat like a snake and pretty much swallow your food whole, you're really skipping this stage of digestion. And you'll notice that if you take a carbohydrate, for instance, and you keep chewing it, you'll notice it becomes sweeter because that enzyme starts to break down the sugar. And so there's also, even before digestion, before you get food in your mouth, it's called the cephalic phase of digestion, and it happens when you smell food or you see food. Have you ever noticed when somebody says, "Are you hungry?" or when you start talking about food, and you weren't hungry in the beginning, but you start having the conversation about food, that you get hungry? And it actually sends signals down into the stomach to start getting ready for the food to come in. So hydrochloric acid secretion is pretty important in that phase. The pharynx, which when you swallow, that helps to keep the food, the epiglottis, it will prevent food from going down into the lungs where we definitely don't want food. But like these salivary glands, they produce up into the mouth, like I said, these digestive enzymes to start the process. The esophagus obviously transports the food into, it's about 10 inches long, down into the stomach. And the liver here is a very complex organ that also regulates sugar, glucose. So it's the big glucose producer, but there's hormones that act on it to slow down the production of glucose. And it also is a big detoxification organ. So there's a lot of things that the liver does, but it puts a lot of its toxins into this little pouch here called the gallbladder. And the pouch also stores bile salts that help emulsify fat that comes into the small intestine. And here's the stomach here, which it is a gigantic bag. In some people it's bigger than others, and some people, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs, but it stores and churns the food, and it creates what we call chyme. And it also will help to, it has its other form of contracting to help mix the food that you've eaten or maybe not chewed thoroughly. And so there's a lot of cells in the stomach that have stretch receptors that when the stomach stretch, they secrete hormones, and we'll get into that later. But then as this passes the food down into the duodenum or the duodenum, wherever you're from, however you pronounce it, that is the first part of the small intestine. There's a lot going on there, and that's actually its own special slide. And then it comes down into two other parts of the ileum and the cecum, into the jejunum and the ileum, into the large intestine, and the large intestine goes all the way down to the rectum where it stores and the feces, and then out the anus into the porcelain pasture. So we'll talk a lot more about this whole area, and I'll bounce back from slide to slide. But then there's also this pancreas here that is very important in insulin regulation and sugar regulation. It also helps buffer the acidic chyme from the stomach that comes into the small intestine. So we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And I want to talk a closer look at this liver and this whole area here. And when the stomach brings the food into this space here, into this duodenum or the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, there's a lot in this area. And here's the gallbladder. Like I said, it stores bile, and bile salts are really important. So when the stomach dumps its food into the small intestine, it's very acidic, and that acid signals to the pancreas to pump out in this pancreatic duct. It pumps out buffering, sort of a buffering solution to help create less acidic chyme so it won't burn the small intestine. And so there's a lot of hormones. Actually, let's not get too caught up in that yet. So I just wanted to kind of show the complexity of the liver and this little area. And so when people have gallstones or gallbladder stones, this is the area that gets usually plugged up. And gallstones are usually dehydrated little stones, or that look like actual stones and pebbles that will get lodged in here. And she sometimes can be an overabundance of toxins in the body that the liver's overproduced, and it can get kind of lodged in here and cause a lot of problems. And that's why a lot of people get their gallbladder removed. And this pancreas here that sits underneath the stomach, like I said, it helps. It pumps out insulin in response to sugars in the blood, but also it creates a buffering solution that will secrete into the small intestine to neutralize that acid food contents that leaves the stomach, so that the small intestine is not going to get burned by that acid. And you probably wonder what protects the stomach from getting burned by the acid, and that's mucus. And so there's also other organ cells inside the stomach that respond to different hormones that produce mucus. And then there's a lot of bacteria that will produce mucus as well. So mucus is really important in the health of the stomach and the GI tract. So let's talk about GI hormones. So this is kind of like a little drawing that kind of talks about stimulatory hormones and inhibiting hormones. And so here's the stomach, the pancreas, the duodenum, sort of similar to the image that I just showed you. But the hormones in the gastrointestinal tract, there's 5 main ones, but there's a lot of them. And they are chemical messengers that signal to the gut to make certain substances to digest and be able to absorb food particles. And the gut and the brain they affect each other in both directions. So the brain has an effect on the gut, and the gut has an effect on the brain. And for instance, gastrin is a hormone in the stomach, and it stimulates the gastric glands to secrete pepsinogen, and which is an inactive form of the enzyme pepsin, and also hydrochloric acid. And the secretion of gastrin is stimulated by the food coming down into the stomach. So when food comes into the stomach, gastrin is secreted. And the secretion is inhibited by a low pH. So when you have a really acidic environment, created by the hydrochloric acid, then that's what inhibits it. And secretin is in the duodenum. So in this area, there's a hormone called secretin. And this hormone it signals the secretin of sodium bicarbonate in the pancreas. So I was telling you about how that pancreas will put out some sodium bicarbonate to buffer that acid. So that's done by the hormone secretin, and it stimulates the secretion of bile and in the liver. And this hormone responds to the acidity of the chyme. It's kind of complex. And the cholecystokinin, or CCK, is in the duodenum, and it stimulates the release of digestive enzymes in the pancreas and stimulates the emptying of the bile in the gallbladder. So the bile is emptied into the gallbladder in response to cholecystokinin, and that hormone is secreted in response to the fat that's in the chyme that comes out of the stomach. And then gastric inhibitory peptide, or GIP, is in the duodenum also, and it decreases the stomach churning in order to slow the emptying of the stomach. So it's another function to induce insulin secretion that comes from the pancreas. And motilin is in the duodenum and increases the migrating myoelectric complex component. Basically, it's the GI motility, so it's a peristalsis. So it stimulates the production of pepsin, which helps you absorb amino acids from the protein. Very, very, very complex and requires actually probably another degree. So let's talk about enzymes here, and I'll bring myself down here. So the enzymes are the process of breaking larger food molecules, so your macromolecules or macronutrients such as your fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, down into subunits small enough to diffuse through a cell membrane and be used by the cell. So digestive enzymes are in the saliva, like I said, amylase. They're in the stomach, so pepsin, pepsinogen, and they're also in the pancreas, so and in the small intestines. So like all these enzymes, like I said, amylase catalyzes the digestion of carbohydrates in the mouth and in the small intestine to make those absorbable into sugars so the brain can use that for energy, and so can the body. Pepsin, which obviously catalyzes digestion of protein in the stomach, and then they're absorbed as amino acids in the small intestine. Lipase, which catalyzes reactions needed to emulsify fats in the small intestine with the help of bile as well. The bile encapsulates the fat and makes it to where it can be emulsified and digested by the lipase. And then trypsin, which in the help of chymotrypsin, catalyzes the further digestion of proteins into the small intestine. So I'm going to bring me back up here. So dysfunctional digestion. So what causes dysfunctional digestion? Processed foods, poor quality fats, preservatives. Hey, wait a minute. We didn't even talk about the large intestine. Let's jump right back up to that. We talked about the small intestine. So the three parts of the small intestine where a lot of the absorption happens. Then the food gets passed to the large intestine. And in the large intestine is where most of all your bacteria is. And that's where you want it to stay. And if you've ever heard of a condition called SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that is a condition where the contents of the large intestine can sort of slow down, so chronic constipation can create SIBO, and it backs up into the small intestine where we don't want it. And also low production of hydrochloric acid can also create SIBO. So for instance, somebody who takes Pepcid AC, Zantac, any of those acid, like a Tums that lowers the acid in the stomach. The acid in the stomach is very important to sort of sanitize the food content. So when you eat organic foods, for instance, you're also eating, unfortunately, sometimes depending on how the food has been processed or, harvested. If it's mass produced, it can have parasites and funguses and molds and yeast and things like that. But with the beauty of having a lot of hydrochloric acid in your stomach, not too much, but just enough, is that it basically sterilizes all of that food coming in. So only the good bacteria hopefully is what will be passed into and created into the large intestine. So we want to keep the small intestine strictly for mostly, not strictly, but mostly for nutrient absorption, and where all of that very complex area right here in this region, you don't want any bacteria, because bacteria sometimes can cause a lot of overgrowth of bacteria can cause a lot of problems in this area and cause inflammation. So then it can't, all of these beautiful systems that of hormone and exchange of nutrients, it becomes compromised. So back to dysfunctional digestion. Basically, it's processed foods. So anything that comes in a box or packaged, if you read a food label that has chemicals in it, or foods that, you know, substances that you don't know or recognize as an actual food, it's processed. Even healthy foods can be processed. Even foods that are breads that are gluten-free are still processed, even though they don't contain food, even though they don't contain gluten, they still are processed. So anything that goes from what it is in nature to many steps to get to something is processed. So poor quality fat, so fried foods, any kind of fat that goes to a high temperature, and most vegetable oils are poor quality fats. So you really want to stick to, we'll talk about sticking to, but just avoiding those fried foods is really important, especially trans fat. And any preservatives, those are all chemicals, medications. Ibuprofen is one of the worst things for your digestive tract. It's been clinically shown to cause leaky gut syndrome. I'll get into that as well. Pesticides that you get in non-organic food. Pesticides kill pests. And like I said, the gut microbiome is little bugs. And the gut microbiome, with all of those bugs and bacteria and yeast, is very important in the overall health. So if you're eating pesticide residues, generally you're basically killing those little bugs. And so eating organic is important. And then high sugar. They all cause inflammation. And inflammation, as everybody knows, is the biggest cause of disease. And ongoing stress can also cause suppressed immune function, and decreased acid production in the stomach. And an interesting little tidbit about acid production is you have to be in a calm environment to produce hydrochloric acid. It's signaled from the brain to the stomach via the vagus nerve in a parasympathetic state. So that's the rest and digest of your nervous system, not the fight or flight, which is the sympathetic nervous system. So it's really important to sit down and eat a meal slowly and mindfully and chew your food thoroughly, and so that you do get that hydrochloric acid production in your stomach. And the hydrochloric acid is not only important in sterilizing the food, but it also creates a better environment to absorb a lot of your minerals such as zinc, magnesium, and iron. And there's another substance called intrinsic factor that helps you convert your B12, which is absorbed in the small intestine. So lots going on in the digestion, and it's very important that all of these systems and all of these little mechanisms just function beautifully. So, like I said, this ongoing stress can cause suppressed immune function and decreased acid production in the stomach. So your first line of defense for your immune system is in your saliva. It's an immunoglobulin called secretory or salivary IgA. And this salivary IgA is basically like the little police officer that's detecting a parasite or a bug or a pathogen that's coming into your mouth, and it will attack it. But if you're stressed out, that sort of little police officer is underprovided, so he doesn't work as well as he would as if he was taken care of. And I think that's how we all are. And so then when that pathogen comes in your mouth, down the esophagus to the stomach, where there's little acid, it has a chance to get into the bowel, which is the small intestine and the large intestine, and create a lot of havoc and overgrowth and a lot of problems. Now, so you have all this stress and processed food. So prolonged stress and inflammation can cause intestinal hyperpermeability. It's also called leaky gut syndrome. So you want to think food sensitivities, which give people gas and bloating, maybe belching if it's higher up in the GI tract, and skin problems. And so skin rashes, people who are also very contact dermatitis, very sensitive to certain things, and also allergies like inhaling allergies. So seasonal allergies can be a result of hyperpermeability in the gut, and also pain, not just abdominal pains, but joint pains and chronic migrating pain that just happens, in your neck or in your low back or your knees. So all of the stress and inflammation that goes on for a long time can cause that hyperpermeability, which can take years to correct if untreated for a while. So prolonged leaky gut or hyperpermeability can cause autoimmunity, such as celiac, Crohn's, and ulcerative colitis. And the autoimmunity is a whole nother mini course, but autoimmunity is irreversible and very tricky to control. And so it requires very harsh measures in diet and lifestyle to control. And it's just a road that you don't want to go down. And if you do go down, you understand how difficult it is to control. Now, prolonged autoimmunity can cause more autoimmunity, and it's called molecular mimicry. So a lot of people who have, say, rheumatoid arthritis that's left untreated and controlled or managed by medications can all of a sudden have celiac disease. And then they get, from celiac disease, they might get thyroid hypothyroiditis, which is Hashimoto's. And so prolonged molecular mimicry can cause debilitation or death. So basically, the takeaway is don't eat processed foods, poor quality fats, preservative chemicals, pesticides, and high sugar foods. Don't put them in your mouth, and reduce reactivity to stress. So what do you do is eat a wide variety of colorful and organic veggies, so no pesticides. And the color is really important to match all the rainbows of the colors of the rainbow of the spectrum of the rainbow, so that you get all those phytonutrients that have a lot of really good health attributes to overall health and cellular function. And so you want 75% of your plate or your diet to cover that much plant-based vegetables. So I'd say 6 to 9 cups of veggies is key every day. You can blend it, you can make it in soups, stews, you can saute it, steam it, whatever you want to do, eat it raw. But getting that amount of veggies, of colorful veggies, is very key in helping your gut to be healthy. Eat minimal sustainable caught or raised meats. You want to think about a serving to be 3 ounces of a serving of sustainable, meaning that it's not mass produced or, like Tyson and a lot of these huge farms that especially these pork plants, these animals are pumped with hormones and they're in just horrible living environments that are really transferred back to the food. So, and what they eat. So you want grass-fed, 100% grass-fed and finished beef. You want wild-caught Atlantic fish. The smaller the fish, the better. So you're lowering the mercury content. And minimal to moderate amounts of gluten-free grains. Some people like keto or paleo, but I feel that a small amount of gluten-free grains is actually good for your gut. And depending on if your gut is where your gut is. If you have a normal amount of bacteria, then I think a small amount of gluten-free grains can be healthy. But if you have overgrowth or dysbiosis, overgrowth of bacteria or yeast, you have to be a little bit more selective about what type of carbohydrates that you're putting in, so you don't get problems from that. And only eat your sugar in the form of whole fruit. So it's pretty much that in a nutshell. And so I hope you've enjoyed the digestion and you understand the anatomy goes from the mouth to the anus out into the porcelain pastures, and it's broken down into the mouth. Actually starts from smelling or seeing food. It's broken down into the mouth, goes down to the esophagus. Lots happening in the stomach, lots of hormones from the gut to the brain. The liver has its job to do. The gallbladder has its job to do. The pancreas has its job to do. There's a lot going on in the small intestine with absorption, and a lot of going on in the large intestine with the microbiome, all of the bacteria that creates enzymes that help keep you healthy. So I hope you enjoyed this mini course, and if you have any questions, please bring them to the open office hours Q&A, and I hope you have a great day.